The sun scorched the red earth of the desert in the year 1874. Taza was a brave warrior who carried the heavy weight of his people in his heart. For many seasons, he had remembered the day his father died in a clash with the soldiers. He blamed one man for the tragedy, and that man was Captain William Harper. Taza had sworn to never trust the settlers who came to the lands of the Apache. After a great storm had passed through the deep canyons, Taza rode his horse along a narrow trail. He found the wreckage of a wagon that had been overturned by the rushing water. Under the broken wood lay a young woman who was badly hurt. Her face was pale and she was close to death. Taza felt a cold anger toward the people of the East, but his honor would not allow him to leave her there. He lifted the heavy timber and carried the woman to his horse. He brought her to a secret camp in the mountains where the Apache lived in peace. An elder named Chief Aponi watched over them. When the woman finally woke, she spoke her name and said it was Eleanor Harper. Taza felt a shock go through his soul. She was the daughter of the man he hated most in the world. As the days turned into weeks, Eleanor slowly recovered her strength. Taza expected her to be arrogant and cold, but he found her to be kind and brave. She helped the elders and showed respect to the Apache ways. Eleanor realized that everything she had been told about these people was wrong. She saw the beauty of their traditions and the depth of their spirits. Taza and Eleanor spent many hours talking by the fire. Eleanor spoke of her father and the deep sadness that he felt. She said that he was haunted by the events of the past and that he had never wanted the violence. They began to look for the truth behind the old conflict. They discovered that a scout named Silas Crow had orchestrated the attack many years ago. Silas had wanted to start a war to steal the land for himself. The truth was a heavy burden, and they knew they had to reveal it to everyone. Taza and Eleanor began a long and dangerous journey across the desert. They traveled through jagged mountains and across burning sands. They were pursued by outlaws and corrupt men who worked for Silas Crow. These men wanted to keep the secret buried forever. Along the way, Taza and Eleanor faced many trials. They fought off attackers and survived the harsh elements of the frontier. Their bond grew stronger. With every mile, they learned to trust one another and their love began to grow. It was a love that could bridge the gap between two worlds. They eventually reached a remote fort where Captain Harper was stationed. Silas Crow tried to silence them one last. The wooden gates of the fort loomed large against the darkening sky as the two riders approached the valley floor. Taza felt the familiar tension in his muscles as he looked upon the blue uniforms of the men on the walls. For many seasons, these walls had represented a cage for his people and a fortress for his enemies. Beside him, Eleanor sat tall on her horse, her face marked with the dust of their long journey, but her eyes burning with a fierce determination. She looked at Taza and saw the conflict in his gaze. She reached out and touched his arm, her hand a gentle reminder of the bond they had forged in the wilderness. They knew that entering this place was a gamble with their lives. Silas Crow had eyes everywhere, and his influence among the scouts and soldiers was a poisonous vine that had grown deep into the foundations of the command. As they reached the outer perimeter, a group of 3 soldiers rode out to meet them. Their rifles were held ready, and their expressions were filled with a mixture of confusion and hostility. One of the men recognized Eliner and shouted in surprise. He called for the gates to be opened and for the captain to be summoned at once. The sound of the heavy iron hinges creaking open echoed through the canyon like a funeral knell. Taza kept his hand away from his weapon, but his spirit was alert to every movement. They rode into the center of the dusty parade ground where a crowd began to gather. Men in sweat-stained shirts and officers with polished buttons stared in silence at the sight of the Apache warrior and the daughter of their commander. From the main office, a tall man with graying hair and a weary face stepped out onto the porch. Captain William Harper stopped in his tracks, his eyes wide with a combination of shock and overwhelming relief. He ran toward them, shouting the name of his daughter. Eliner slid from her saddle and collapsed into her father's arms. Taza remained on his horse, a silent sentinel in a world that wanted him dead. He watched the reunion with a heavy heart, thinking of his own father who would never hold him again. Suddenly, a voice broke through the emotional moment. It was a cold and raspy voice that Taza recognized from the shadows of his memory. Sila's crow stepped forward from the edge of the crowd. He was a man with a jagged scar across his cheek and eyes that held no light. He pointed a trembling finger at Taza and accused him of kidnapping the captain's daughter. Silas claimed that Taza was a savage who had used Eliner as a shield to enter the fort. He urged the soldiers to pull the warrior from his horse and hang him from the nearest tree. The crowd began to murmur, and the tension spiked as several men reached for their holsters. Captain Harper looked up from his daughter, his face hardening into a mask of command. He looked at Taza and then back at the man who had served as his most trusted scout for 10 years. Eliner stepped between her father and the angry soldiers. She raised her voice so that everyone in the fort could hear her. She spoke of the storm and the wreckage and how Taza had saved her life when he could have easily let her perish. She spoke of the kindness of the Apache people and the wisdom of Chief Aponi. Most importantly, she spoke of the secret they had uncovered in the high mountains. She reached into her saddlebag and pulled out a small leather-bound ledger. This was the record kept by a man who had worked for Sila's crow many years ago. It contained the details of a plan to incite a massacre. It showed that Sila's had provided the weapons and the false information that led the soldiers to attack the camp of Taza's father. Silas had wanted the land cleared of all people so that he could claim the mineral rights for a mining company he secretly owned. Sila's crow saw his world crumbling around him. He realized that the truth was finally out in the open. In a moment of pure desperation, he drew his revolver and aimed it at Eliner. He was determined to silence the witness who had destroyed his life of lies. But Taza was faster than any man Silas had ever encountered. Taza did not use a gun. He leaned forward and spurred his horse with a sharp command. The animal surged toward the villain. Taza reached down and caught the arm of the scout, twisting it until the weapon fell into the dirt. With a powerful movement, Taza vaulted from his horse and tackled Silas to the ground. They struggled in the dust for a moment, but the strength of the warrior was born of justice, while the strength of the scout was born of greed. Taza pinned Silas to the earth and looked into the eyes of the man who had caused so much suffering. For a heartbeat, Taza felt the urge to take the life of the man who had killed his father. He felt the ancient law of blood calling to him. But then he looked at Elinor and he remembered the words of Chief Apache. True strength is found in the ability to forgive and the wisdom to seek peace. Taza let go of the man and stood up. He stepped back and allowed the soldiers to move in and place Sela's crow in heavy iron chains. Captain Harper approached Taza. The two men stood face to face for the first time without a barrier of fire or steel between them. The captain looked at the warrior and saw the reflection of a man he had once respected long ago. He realized that he had been a pawn in a game played by a greedy man. He saw the pain in Taza's eyes and the honor in his posture. The captain removed his hat and bowed his head in a gesture of profound apology. He told Taza that he could never replace what was lost, but he promised that the rest of his life would be spent making amends. He promised that the soldiers would respect the borders of the Apache land and that justice would be served for the crimes of the past. In the days that followed, a great meeting was held at the edge of the desert. Chief Apache led a procession of Apache elders to the gates of the fort. They did not come with war paint or weapons, but with the symbols of their heritage. They brought gifts of woven blankets and baskets filled with the fruit of the land. The soldiers stood in a line of honor as the elders passed. A new treaty was drafted on the table in the middle of the parade ground. This was not a treaty of surrender, but a treaty of partnership. It recognized the rights of the Apache to their ancestral homes and established a system of fair trade. Captain Harper and Chief Apache signed the document with Taza and Elinor acting as the primary witnesses. The transition from war to peace was not easy. There were many on both sides who still held bitterness in their hearts. But Taza and Elinor became the living bridge between the two worlds. They spent their time traveling between the mountain camps and the settler towns. They taught the children of both peoples that there was a common ground to be found in the beauty of the earth and the truth of the human spirit. Taza learned the language of the settlers and used it to defend his people in the courts of law. Elinor learned the medicinal secrets of the Apache and used them to heal the sick in the remote frontier outposts. One evening, as the sun dipped below the jagged peaks of the mountains, Taza and Elinor sat together on a high ridge overlooking the valley. The sky was a vibrant tapestry of orange and purple and deep gold. Below them they could see the campfires of the Apache and the distant lights of the fort. The two worlds were no longer at war, but were resting in a shared quiet. Elinor leaned her head against Taza's shoulder and felt the steady beat of his heart. She asked him if he ever regretted the day he found her in the wreckage of the wagon. Taza smiled and took her hand in his. He told her that on that day he thought he was saving a life, but he realized now that she had saved his soul. He had been a prisoner of his own hatred, and she had given him the key to be free. As the years passed, the story of the Apache warrior and the captain's daughter became a legend told by grandmothers to their grandchildren. It was a story of a time when the world was changing and the old ways were fading. It was a reminder that even in the harshest of lands, love could bloom like a desert flower after a long rain. The land of the Southwest remained a place of great challenges and many struggles, but the foundation of peace that Taza and Elinor built was strong. The blood that had once soaked the red Earth was replaced by the sweat of honest labor and the laughter of children playing in the sun. Chief Aponi lived to a very old age, and he often spoke of the vision he had seen of a future where all people walked together. He saw Taza as the fulfillment of that vision, a leader who knew when to fight and when to lay down his arms. The captain eventually retired from the army and built a small ranch near the border of the Apache lands. He spent his final years as a friend to the people he had once been ordered to fight. He often hosted Taza and Alina for dinner where they would talk late into the night about the truth they had found and the lies they had defeated. Sila's crow was sent to a prison far to the east where he spent the rest of his days in a small cell. He had tried to steal the land, but in the end he had nothing but the cold stone walls and his own bitter thoughts. His name became a warning to those who would use greed to start conflicts. The mining company he had built was dissolved, and the land was returned to its rightful protectors. The desert wind continued to blow through the canyons and across the mesas, carrying the songs of the Apache and the stories of the frontier. The red earth remained as it always had been, beautiful and unforgiving, but it was no longer a place defined by the scars of the past. It was a place of hope and a place where a new chapter had begun. Taza and Alina stood together as the guardians of that hope. They had walked through the fire of tragedy and emerged with a bond that could not be broken. They were the proof that no matter how deep the wounds of history might be, they could always be healed by the power of truth and the enduring strength of love. Their journey had taken them across the burning sands and through the darkest of nights, but they had found the dawn at last. The peace they had won was a gift to the peace that followed the signing of the treaty was not a sudden silence, but a slow and careful song that grew louder with each passing moon. Taza and Alina stood at the center of this new world, serving as the steady hands that kept the scales of justice balanced. The initial months were filled with the heavy work of rebuilding trust. Taza spent many days riding between the various Apache bands, explaining the terms of the agreement and sharing the truth about the betrayal of Sila's crow. Many of the younger warriors were skeptical. They had known only the sting of broken promises and the taste of bitter dust. Taza spoke to them not as a man who had forgotten the past, but as one who had seen a way to protect the future. He told them that revenge was a fire that eventually burned the hand that held the torch. He showed them his own scars and explained that while they would never fade, they no longer had to bleed. Alina worked just as hard within the walls of the fort and the growing settlements. She faced the cold stares of those who thought she had turned her back on her own people. Some of the officers' wives whispered behind her back, and some of the soldiers looked at her with a mixture of pity and suspicion. Alina ignored the gossip. She focused her energy on creating a school where the children of the settlers and the children of the Apache could learn together. She believed that if the next generation could share a classroom, they would never find a reason to share a battlefield. She taught the English language to the Apache youth, and she learned the complex and beautiful tongue of Taza's people from Chief Aponi. It was a slow process of weaving two separate threads into a single fabric. One afternoon in the late autumn, a group of cattlemen arrived from the east. They were driving a large herd of longhorn cattle, and they were determined to pass through the heart of the Apache grazing lands. The leader of the group was a man named Miller who had a reputation for being quick with his gun and slow with his reason. He ignored the warnings of the scouts and set up a camp near a sacred spring that had been used by Taza's people for centuries. When the Apache hunters found the cattle muddying the water and the men cutting down ancient trees for firewood, the tension reached a breaking point. A young warrior named Goyo, who had lost his brother in the old wars, wanted to strike the camp at night and drive the intruders away with arrows. Taza heard of the trouble and rode out immediately. He did not go alone. He asked Elinor to accompany him so that the settlers would see a familiar face from their own culture. When they arrived at the spring, the air was thick with the scent of smoke and the lowing of tired cattle. Miller and his men stood with their rifles ready, thinking that the Apache were coming to start a fight. Taza dismounted and walked forward unarmed. He did not raise his voice, but his presence was like a mountain that could not be moved. He explained to Miller that they were standing on land that was protected by the treaty signed by Captain Harper. He told the cattlemen that there were other trails to the south that had plenty of grass and water without disturbing the sacred sites of the Apache. Miller laughed and said that a piece of paper did not mean anything to a man with 1,000 head of cattle. He pointed his rifle at Taza and told him to move aside. Elinor stepped forward, then her eyes flashing with the same fire that her father possessed. She looked Miller in the eye and told him that if he fired a single shot, he would not just be starting a war with the Apache, but he would be answerable to the United States Army. She reminded him that her father was the commander of the fort and that he would personally ensure that any man who broke the peace would face a hangman's noose. The cattlemen looked at each other with uncertainty. They saw the strength in Elinor's face and the calm resolve in Taza. Miller eventually lowered his weapon. He realized that the world had changed and the law was no longer something he could ignore. Taza showed them the way to the Southern Trail, and the crisis was averted without a single drop of blood being shed. This event became a turning point for many. It showed that the treaty was not just words on a page, but a living shield for all who lived on the frontier. As the winter snows began to fall on the high peaks, Taza and Elinor found time to focus on their own lives. They built a small cabin in a valley that sat halfway between the fort and the main Apache camp. The cabin was made of heavy pine logs and stone, and it became a symbol of their union. It was a place where both cultures were honored. Inside, the walls were decorated with traditional Apache weaving and shelves filled with books from the East. During the long, cold nights, they sat by the hearth and shared stories of their childhoods. Taza spoke of the days when his father would take him into the mountains to teach him how to track the mountain lion and how to listen to the wind. He spoke of the deep spiritual connection his people had with the land and how every rock and tree had a story to tell. Elinor spoke of her life in the green hills of Virginia and the music she had played on the piano in her mother's house. She told him of the books she had read and the dreams she had of seeing the vast reaches of the West. They found that despite their different backgrounds, they shared the same values of honor and loyalty and a deep love for the natural world. In the spring, Captain Harper decided to step down from his post at the fort. The years of conflict had taken a toll on his spirit, and he wanted to spend his remaining days in peace. He bought a stretch of land near the cabin of Taza and Alina and started a small ranch. He and Chief Aponi became unlikely friends. The two old men could often be seen sitting on the porch of the ranch house sharing a pipe and talking about the mistakes of the past and the hopes for the future. They had both lost much in the wars, and they found a quiet comfort in each other's company. They were the elders of a new society, and their friendship served as a guide for everyone else. The most difficult journey for Taza and Alina came on the first anniversary of their meeting. Taza wanted to take Alina back to the canyon where he had found her trapped under the wagon. He also wanted to take her to the site of the attack where his father had been killed so many years ago. It was a pilgrimage of healing and closure. They rode through the desert for 3 days until they reached the narrow trail where the storm had nearly taken Alina's life. The wreckage of the wagon was still there, although it was now bleached white by the sun and half buried in the sand. Alina stood by the broken wood and felt a shiver of memory. She remembered the cold water and the weight of the timber and the moment when she thought her life was over. She looked at Taza and took his hand. She told him that she finally understood that the storm had not been a tragedy but a beginning. It had stripped away her old life and given her a new one. Taza nodded and led her further into the canyon to a spot where the walls were high and red. He pointed to a small pile of stones at the base of a cliff. This was where his father had fallen. For a long time they stood in silence. Taza knelt and placed a small eagle feather on the stones. He spoke to his father in the language of his people, telling him that the war was over and that the man who had caused the tragedy was now in a cage. He told his father that he had found a woman who carried a spirit of peace and that their families were now joined. As he spoke, the wind began to howl through the canyon, and it sounded like a soft voice of approval. Taza felt the heavy weight that he had carried in his heart for years finally lift away. The anger was gone, replaced by a sense of profound quiet. They returned to their valley and continued their work. As the years passed, the frontier changed. More settlers arrived and the towns grew larger, but the peace held firm. Taza and Alina had 3 children, and each of them was raised to walk in 2 worlds. They were taught the skills of the Apache hunter and the knowledge of the Eastern scholar. They were the first generation of a new people who did not see a boundary between the red earth and the blue sky. The story of the warrior and the soldier's daughter was told around campfires and in schoolrooms across the territory. It reminded people that even in a land defined by violence, there was a path to reconciliation. It showed that truth was the only weapon that could truly end a war. Sila's crow remained in his prison cell, but his name was eventually forgotten by most. What was remembered was the sight of Taza and Alina riding together across the mesa, their horses moving as one under the vast and golden sun. One day, a young journalist from a newspaper in the East traveled to the frontier to interview Taza. The man wanted to write a story about the famous Apache who had married the captain's daughter. He asked Taza if he still felt the sting of the old prejudice, or if he felt that the world had truly changed. Taza looked at the man and then at his children playing in the grass and at Alina, who was tending to her garden. He told the journalist that change does not come from the government or from the generals. He said that change comes from the heart of one person who is brave enough to see the humanity in their enemy. He said that they were not living in a perfect world, but they were living in a world where hope was possible. Chief Apache passed away in his sleep during a warm summer night. His funeral was attended by hundreds of people, both Apache and settler. It was the largest gathering the territory had ever seen. Taza spoke at the service, saying that the chief had been the North Star that guided them through the darkest night. He promised that the wisdom of the elders would never be forgotten. Captain Harper stood by Taza's side, his hand on the warrior's shoulder. They were no longer soldier and scout or enemy and ally. They were family. The American Southwest remained a place of great beauty and harsh challenges. There were droughts and there were storms and there were moments of hardship. But the foundation that had been built by Taza and Aliner was strong enough to weather any trial. They had turned a history of blood into a future of promise. As they grew old together, they often sat on their porch and watched the sun go down over the horizon. They watched the colors change from gold to crimson to the deep blue of the evening. They knew that their time on the earth was a small part of a much larger story. The red earth would always be there, and the wind would always blow through the canyons. But because of their courage, the song of the land was now a song of peace. They had proven that love is the strongest force in the universe, and that it can bridge any gap and heal any wound. Taza took Aliner's hand, and they looked out at the land they loved. The silence was not the silence of a graveyard, but the quiet of a world at rest. They were the guardians of the truth and the keepers of the light, and their legacy would live on in the hearts of all who followed in their footsteps. The sun finally dipped below the peaks, and the first stars began to twinkle in the vast expanse of the desert sky. All was well in the land of the Apache and the home of the daughter who had brought the dawn. The shadows of the past were gone, and only the bright promise of the tomorrow remained. The legacy of Taza and Aliner was not found in monuments of stone or in the pages of history books alone. It was found in the way the local farmers shared their harvest with the Apache families during lean years. It was found in the way the Apache scouts helped the lost travelers find their way through the treacherous mountain passes. The bridge they had built was made of thousands of small acts of kindness and understanding. It was a bridge that grew stronger with every passing year. The story of their love became a part of the land itself, whispered by the leaves of the cottonwood trees and etched into the timeless faces of the canyon walls. They had shown the world that even the deepest of divides can be crossed if one has the courage to take the first step. And as the night deepened and the desert air grew cool, the warmth of their spirit remained a steady flame that would never be extinguished. In the final years of his life, the sun continued to set over the jagged peaks of the mountains, casting long and golden shadows across the valley floor. The peace that followed the signing of the treaty was not a sudden silence, but a slow and careful song that grew louder with each passing moon. Taza and Aliner stood at the center of this new world, serving as the steady hands that kept the scales of justice balanced. The initial months were filled with the heavy work of rebuilding trust. Taza spent many days riding between the various Apache bands, explaining the terms of the agreement and sharing the truth about the betrayal of Sila's Crow. Many of the younger warriors were skeptical, for they had known only the sting of broken promises and the taste of bitter dust. Taza spoke to them not as a man who had forgotten the past, but as one who had seen a way to protect the future. He told them that revenge was a fire that eventually burned the hand that held the torch. He showed them his own scars and explained that while they would never fade, they no longer had to bleed. Elinor worked just as hard within the walls of the fort and the growing settlements. She faced the cold stares of those who thought she had turned her back on her own people. Some of the officers' wives whispered behind her back, and some of the soldiers looked at her with a mixture of pity and suspicion. Elinor ignored the gossip. She focused her energy on creating a school where the children of the settlers and the children of the Apache could learn. Together, she believed that if the next generation could share a classroom, they would never find a reason to share a battlefield. She taught the English language to the Apache youth, and she learned the complex and beautiful tongue of the people from Chief Aponi. It was a slow process of weaving two separate threads into a single fabric. One afternoon in the late autumn, a group of cattlemen arrived from the east. They were driving a large herd of longhorn cattle, and they were determined to pass through the heart of the Apache grazing lands. The leader of the group was a man named Miller who had a reputation for being quick with his gun and slow with his reason. He ignored the warnings of the scouts and set up a camp near a sacred spring that had been used by the tribes for centuries. When the Apache hunters found the cattle muddying the water and the men cutting down ancient trees for firewood, the tension reached a breaking point. A young warrior named Goyo, who had lost his brother in the old wars, wanted to strike the camp at night and drive the intruders away with arrows. Taza heard of the trouble and rode out immediately. He did not go alone. He asked Elinor to accompany him so that the settlers would see a familiar face from their own culture. When they arrived at the spring, the air was thick with the scent of smoke and the lowing of tired cattle. Miller and his men stood with their rifles ready, thinking that the Apache were coming to start a fight. Taza dismounted and walked forward unarmed. He did not raise his voice, but his presence was like a mountain that could not be moved. He explained to Miller that they were standing on land that was protected by the treaty signed by Captain Harper. He told the cattlemen that there were other trails to the south that had plenty of grass and water without disturbing the sacred sites of the people. Miller laughed and said that a piece of paper did not mean anything to a man with 1,000 head of cattle. He pointed his rifle at Taza and told him to move aside. Elinor stepped forward, then her eyes flashing with a fierce light. She looked Miller in the eye and told him that if he fired a single shot, he would not just be starting a war with the Apache, but he would be answerable to the United States Army. She reminded him that her father was the commander of the fort, and that he would personally ensure that any man who broke the peace would face a heavy sentence. The cattlemen looked at each other with uncertainty. They saw the strength in the face of the woman and the calm resolve in the warrior. Miller eventually lowered his weapon. Taza showed them the way to the southern trail, and the crisis was averted without a drop of blood being shed. This event became a turning point for many, showing that the treaty was a living shield for all who lived on the frontier. As the winter snows began to fall on the high peaks, Taza and Elinor found time to focus on their own lives. They built a small cabin in a valley that sat halfway between the fort and the main Apache camp. The cabin was made of heavy pine logs and stone, and it became a symbol of their union. It was a place where both cultures were honored. Inside, the walls were decorated with traditional weaving and shelves filled with books from the East. During the long, cold nights, they sat by the hearth and shared stories of their childhoods. Taza spoke of the days when his father would take him into the mountains to teach him how to track the mountain lion and how to listen to the wind. He spoke of the deep spiritual connection his people had with the land and how every rock and tree had a story to tell. Elinor spoke of her life in the green hills of Virginia and the music she had played on the piano in the house of her mother. They found that despite their different backgrounds, they shared the same values of honor and loyalty. The years of peace grew into a decade of prosperity as the desert began to yield its secrets to those who treated it with respect. Taza and Elinor raised 3 children in that valley, each one a living testament to the union of 2 peoples. Their eldest son was named Michael Little Bear, and he possessed the quiet intensity of his father and the analytical mind of his mother. Their second child was a daughter named Maria Sky Woman, who inherited the musical spirit of the Eastern Hills and the deep connection to the earth that the Apache held sacred. The youngest was a boy named Joseph Running Fox, whose laughter could be heard across the mesas and whose skill with a horse was known from the fort to the distant canyons. The greatest threat to their work came 10 years after the treaty, when the expansion of the railroad reached the edge of the desert. The representatives of the company were men who saw the land only as an obstacle. They brought with them maps that ignored the boundaries of the Apache lands. They planned to blast through the sacred painted canyon, which was the resting place of many generations of ancestors. Taza and Elinor knew that a physical conflict would only lead to a return to the dark days of war. They chose instead to fight with the weapons of the modern world. They traveled for many weeks by stagecoach and train to reach the capital city in the east. Taza wore his traditional buckskins and his silver medallion, and Elinor wore a dress of deep blue. In the grand halls of justice, they stood before a committee of men who had never seen the red dust of the Southwest. Taza spoke first, and his voice was like the rolling of thunder across the plains. He told them that the land was not something to be bought and sold, but a living history of a people who had survived for thousands of years. Elinor then spoke with a clarity that silenced the room. She produced the ledgers of Sela's crow and the diaries of her father. She argued that the railroad could be moved to the north, where the ground was flat and no spirits would be disturbed. The committee was moved by their words and ruled in favor of the diversion. The painted canyon was saved. This victory proved that the Apache had a voice that could be heard even in the distant halls of power. As Taza and Elinor entered their twilight years, the world around them continued to change, but the core of their life remained pure. They spent their days tending to their garden and their evenings watching the sun go down. Taza would often sit with the young men and teach them that true bravery was found in protecting a family. Elinor would sit with the women and share the stories of her journey from a frightened girl in a wrecked wagon to the mother of a shared nation. Captain Harper lived to see his grandchildren graduate from the school his daughter had built. He became a man of great gentleness in his old age. When he finally passed away, his last words were of gratitude for the warrior who had saved his daughter and forgiven his sins. The sun was low on the horizon on a warm evening in the year 1905. Taza was now a man of 70 winters, and his hair was the color of the winter snow. Beside him on the high ridge sat Elena, whose beauty had only deepened with the lines of wisdom on her face. They were surrounded by their grandchildren who looked up at them with eyes full of wonder. Taza pointed to the valley below where the lights of the town and the fires of the camp were beginning to glow. He told the children the story one last time. He spoke of the great storm and the overturned wagon and the woman who had changed everything. He told them that they carried the blood of two great nations and that it was their duty to be the peacemakers of the future. He took the hand of Elena and felt the warmth that had sustained him for over 30 years. He told the children that they were the most important part of the story, for they were the bridge that would never be broken. The stars began to emerge in the velvet sky, and a cool breeze blew up from the canyon. Taza felt a sense of completion that he had never known as a young man. The cycle was whole, and the red earth was at peace. He looked at the lights of the fort and the fires of the camp, and he smiled, knowing that the world he was leaving behind was a better place than the one he had entered. The warrior and the daughter had finished their journey, but their spirit would always ride across the red earth as a reminder that the path of honor is the only path that leads home. The shadows of the past were gone, and only the bright promise of tomorrow remained. The legacy of Taza and Elena was found in the way the local farmers shared their harvest with the Apache families. It was found in the way the scouts helped the travelers find their way through the mountain passes. The bridge they had built was made of thousands of small acts of kindness. Their story became a part of the land itself, whispered by the leaves of the trees and etched into the faces of the canyon walls. They had shown the world that even the deepest of divides can be crossed if one has the courage to take the first step. As the night deepened and the desert air grew cool, the warmth of their spirit remained a steady flame. Taza leaned back and closed his eyes for a moment, listening to the sounds of the children laughing. Elena whispered his name, and he opened his eyes to see her smiling at him in the starlight. They were the guardians of a light that would never go out. The journey was over, and they were home in the land they had saved. Every wound had been healed by the power of truth, and every heart had found its way to peace. The history of blood was replaced by a future of hope, and the red earth held them both in a gentle embrace that would last for all time. The story was finished, and the peace was complete.